Bonjour classe. So let's talk about indirect objects. What is an indirect object? As you may guess, it is a noun or a pronoun that receives the action of the verb indirectly. You don't actually act on this thing, you do something else to this thing. So you have to have a preposition between the verb and the indirect object. In French, it's normally the preposition a. So how do you find an indirect object? You take the subject and the verb, start the sentence in your head, and then add the question after the verb, to whom. I always say to whom because what is not an indirect object. Indirect objects must be people. So you ask, he is working. Okay, let's talk about indirect objects. So what is an indirect object? An indirect object is a noun or a pronoun that indirectly receives the action of the verb. So since it's indirect, in French you must have a preposition between the verb and the indirect object. Normally that is the preposition a. So to find the indirect object, you start with the subject and the verb, and then you ask to whom. The indirect object is always a person, it is not a thing. So you must ask to whom, not to what. So, for example, if I say, I gave the girl the flowers, you say, I gave to whom? Well, the girl is the answer to that. So to the girl, that's the indirect object phrase. So here's a little practice. Look at these French sentences and see if you can identify the indirect object. Now remember, in French you must have a preposition before the indirect object. So that preposition or prepositional phrase is part of the indirect object. So in the first sentence, il écrit une lettre au président, there is no a per se, but there is an a inside of o, because o, you'll remember, is a plus le. So au président, that is the indirect object phrase. So see if you can find the other four and then go on to the next slide. Here are the answers. Okay, be careful. Just like with direct objects, sometimes there's not a one-to-one correspondence between English and French. Some things we use a preposition for in English and the French don't. Some things the French use a preposition and the English does not. So, for instance, j'écoute ma mère. In French, that's a direct object. There is no a. But in English, you have to my mother. That makes it indirect. J'obéis à mes parents. That in French is an indirect object, even though in English we think of it as a direct object since we do not use a preposition with obey. So be careful. There are a few verbs that you have to watch out for. As always, you can replace a noun with a pronoun. So example, I give presents to my friends, I give them presents, or I give presents to them. In English, we have a choice how we want to say that. In French, you do not. In French, you simply use one indirect object pronoun, not a preposition plus a pronoun. So in French, you have Marc donne des fleurs à sa petite amie. You have to say Marc lui donne des fleurs. You can't say Marc donne des fleurs à lui or à elle. You can't say that. Okay, here are the possible indirect object pronouns, or IOPs. You'll notice that the first person and the second person, me and nous, te and vous, are exactly the same as the direct object, but they are not used in the same function. So you have to analyze the action of the sentence and see, is this being used as a direct object or is this being used as an indirect object? So you have to think it through a little bit. In the third person, it's clear because lui is only for indirect objects, as is leur. There is no le, lar, les. Notice that there is only one third-person singular indirect object pronoun. It is lui. Even if you're talking about a girl, it's still lui. So where do you put these indirect object pronouns? You put them, as with the direct object pronouns, in front of the verb of which it is the indirect object. So if you say tu me téléphones, oui, je te téléphone, it goes before the téléphone. If you have an infinitive, il veut me donner son adresse, non, il ne veut pas vous donner son adresse. You put it before the infinitive because you're giving it to you. It's not that you're wanting it to you. And if there's a negative in the sentence, it's inside the sandwich, so it follows the ne in the sentence. In the passé composé, it's still placed, as is the direct object, before the auxiliary verb, before the form of avoir. The good thing about the indirect objects is that there is no agreement between the past participle and the indirect object pronoun. It does not matter if it's singular or plural, masculine, feminine, it's always the same, and you don't have to change the past participle at all. Okay, here's some practice. See if you can replace the indirect object with a pronoun here. Do all of them and then turn to the next slide and see if we have that.